Chips. Great to be on your show today. My name is Susan Stryker, and I'm a historian. And among other things, I've studied the history of San Francisco's Tenderloin, and particularly the history of trans people in the Tenderloin. You'd asked me a question earlier about an article that I'd written about the Tenderloin and trans people in the Tenderloin, where I talked about it being what I was calling a containment zone. What do I mean by a containment zone? What I mean quite literally is that it is a physically segregated space. I mean, we tend to talk about segregation as having mostly to do with race, segregated schools, segregated public facilities, or we talk about a ghetto and we think about a ghetto as having a racial dimension to it. But the Tenderloin historically was a sex work ghetto. It was a part of the city set aside as a place for commercial sexual activity and for other criminalized activities like gambling or drug dealing. It was the place where so-called vice activities would take place. Such districts were often tourist destinations. People would do what they called slumming. You would see it even in fairly recent times, like the Greyhound buses would pull up outside the drag clubs in North Beach. So the Tenderloin was a slumming zone where bourgeois tourists and out-of-towners would go to, find somebody to pay to spend a few hours of the night with, or to score some drugs, or to see a late night after-hours show, or during Prohibition to go find a speakeasy. The Tenderloin was the place where criminalized activity would take place, often under the cover of corrupt policing, that the police would allow something illegal to happen as long as they got their cut. I think there was both a pull and a push to this, that there were people who wanted to go to those kinds of neighborhoods or live in them. Certainly, I know in some of my interviews with some trans women, they would say like, well, that's where the action was. That's where my friends would be. That's where the business was if they were engaged in cruising and hooking up and hooking. But, as I was saying, it was also a containment zone. It was the place that people were directed to, that they were confined within. There's one interview I did with a trans woman who came to San Francisco in like 1967, 68. She thought of herself as a hippie, so she went to the Haight when she landed in town, and she got picked up her first night in town by the police, who said, "This is not your neighborhood." They threw her in the back of the patrol car, and they dropped her off on the Tenderloin and said, "This is where you belong." So, there's both a community to be found in those segregated ghettos, and it's also a result of violence, of social discrimination, social and economic violence.
Can you talk more about that community and the belonging, like in the face of the restrictive and heavily policed environment that people are allowed to be in a certain few block radius? How did community form, or how did belonging form in that context?
Well, if you've got somebody who's facing some of the same kinds of societal prejudices that you face, who maybe have some of the same kinds of interests that you have. But back to that question of, there's both a push and a pull to the Tenderloin. It's like, let's say you're that trans woman I interviewed who came to San Francisco in 1967, thinks she's a hippie, goes to the Haight. She's looking to drop out, turn on, and tune in with Flower Children because that's how she thinks about herself. That's what she wants to belong to. But the police say, nope, this is not your neighborhood. Your neighborhood is here. This is where you need to be. And so in that kind of confinement zone, that residential ghetto for trans women, many of whom by necessity or choice are involved in commercial sexual activity, it's like if there's somebody else who's there, experiencing similar circumstances, it's like they might be your roommate at a SRO hotel. They might be somebody you see at a, all night cafeteria. There might be somebody who could have your back because they've got the same issues. But maybe at another night, it's like they're gonna feel like they're competing for the same boyfriend, or there's gonna be both solidarity and rivalry. There's gonna be friendships and jealousies. One of the things that I've heard from some of the other oral history work that I've done is that at places like Compton's Cafeteria, which used to be at the corner of Turk and Taylor Streets in the Tenderloin, it was a racially mixed and integrated space, and that what some of the trans women I've talked to who were there, they would say, well, the white girls would be with the white girls, and the brown girls would be with the brown girls, and the Asian girls would be with the Asian girls, and the black girls would be with the black girls. But when the police came in, we were all trans. And so sometimes there's differences within a community, but that in the face of external oppression, people know what they're banding together as, that they were banding together as a trans or street oriented community against the police who were, giving them hell.
So you bring up Compton's Cafeteria, Gene Compton's Cafeteria. Tell me what you've learned about the importance of that place in the community.
Compton's was, I call it, a clean, well lighted place for cheap food that was open all night and didn't card you when you came through the door. So it attracted just a lot of people who were neighborhood denizens, particularly say younger people who maybe were precariously housed, and like they wanted a place where they could just kind of hang out for hours on end, maybe get one cup of coffee and load it up with a lot of sugar from the sugar shaker and just sit there with their friends and camp out for 2 or 3 or 4 hours to get out of the, chilly, foggy San Francisco nights. There used to be a lot of late night cafeterias in San Francisco. I mean, it was kind of just, it's like, think of that famous painting, Nighthawks at the Diner, or a Dashiell Hammett novel, hard-boiled noir film, there's the Greasy Spoon that's open all night and people are sitting around on their bar stools or at the tables. And, it was just part of working class downtown culture. And Compton's was one of those kinds of places, except it was relatively large. I think it seated something like 168 people, and that it was often hopping because it was at a very central location. A lot of their customers were the people who lived in the neighborhood, not just slumming tourists coming in, but people who lived in the SRO hotels, kind of in the blocks that intersected at Turk and Taylor. One of the things I know from other historical work is that there's probably at one point about half a dozen of the SRO hotels down along Turk Street and just in the immediate vicinity of the intersection of Turk and Taylor, that had reputations for being what they called Queens hotels, that they would be some of the only places in the city that would rent to gender variant trans feminine people. I've seen newspaper stories that estimate that in the mid 60s, there were probably around 600 transgender residents of the Tenderloin in that few block area. And, a lot of those people were engaged in sex work because they didn't have any other work. And they were hanging out at places like Compton's or other late night diners as a place to say, like, get out of the weather. I've heard people say, oh, we would always go to Compton's if we wanted to show off a new outfit or a new boyfriend. It was kind of like the place to see and be seen in the Tenderloin. If you were, in a certain stratum of society there. Compton's would get written up in the newspapers. There was a newspaper columnist with the Chronicle, Herb Cain, who was sort of famous in his day. Many people still remember him. Supposedly the inventor of 3-dot journalism, just little snippets of city life, and he wrote frequently about Comptons, and he described what he called the weird nicks who would hang out in the 2 to 3 a.m. period, or the strangelings, or, oh, this is one of the sights of the city. If you haven't seen it, it's positively eerie. So Compton's was just well known as the place to go if you kind of wanted to be taking a walk on the wild side and, you know, see where the nightlife was.
So I want to get into the what happened at Compton's famously. One question going back to talking about the gender divergent or whatever you want to call the sex workers, the vice. This didn't start in the 60s. This has been in the Tenderloin for a long time.
Right. And that's kind of a complicated question, because one of the things that you see in US cities in general is that as you start to have larger industrial cities, not just, like port cities like Boston or Charleston, South Carolina, that once you get these sort of big industrial mass cities, uh, they started to be zoned, spatially organized. Is like, this kind of activity goes in this part of the city, this kind of activity goes in this part of the city. Because, back in the old days, it was kind of like, well, maybe you're a shopkeeper and you live above the shop and you have a vegetable plot next to your house. And then even when they started building factories, like they would build factories, like narrow and tall, because that was worked better with, steam power and conveyor belts and whatnot. But as industrialization proceeds, you get, the factories are on the outskirts of town, and then you have residential districts and you have business districts, that you start to organize the city according to function. And that once that really starts, sort of in the mid 19th century, part of the function of the city is to set aside a part of the city where the poor people live or the people of color live, or like on the West Coast, you have a Chinatown and you have a sex work zone. You have a so-called Tenderloin. And so San Francisco has a Tenderloin from the time that it's San Francisco, from like post, 1848. There's a huge population boom in San Francisco with the gold rush. It goes from, like a sleepy village, Yerba Buena of 200 people in the Mexican period with some ranchos and the Mission and a Presidio, to boom, all of a sudden there's 50,000 people. San Francisco's the largest city on the Pacific Rim. So for its time, it was huge. And in that huge population boom, almost immediately by around 1854, you see vigilance committees, basically like white supremacist gangs who use extrajudicial violence to forcibly segregate the city. Like, this is the Latin Quarter, this is Little Italy, this is Chinatown. And, that one of the neighborhoods is the Tenderloin. Where the Tenderloin is changes geographically over time. It used to be more downtown. And what is the Tenderloin now? They used to call it the new Uptown Tenderloin. But that part of the city has been a red light district basically since it was rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake.
Getting back to Compton's Cafeteria, you and with a partner produced a film, Screaming Queens. Was that 20 years ago? Then that came out.
Let's see, that was, well, 21 now. Yeah, a friend of mine at school, Victor Silverman, and we both always had an interest in filmmaking. And when Victor was on sabbatical and I was working more as a community-based rather than academic historian, I just said, like, Victor, it's like, I've got this great story, the Compton's Cafeteria riot. And it was like Stonewall, but it was in San Francisco, and it was 3 years before Stonewall that this riot happens here. And so, we just, it was a buddy film in a sense. I just made it with a good friend. It's been one of the honors of my life to be I would say, one of the stewards of that story.
So that story, when you did this, was kind of vulnerable to being lost to history. Like, there wasn't a lot out there, certainly, on it, and you kind of brought it a little bit into the daylight. Why is it important that that story goes on?
Well, I think it's important any time to tell stories about marginalized, politically oppressed, socially oppressed, stigmatized people who stand up for themselves and just assert their basic human dignity, like their right to be alive, that they're not asking for anybody's permission, they're not taking the crap that is doled out to them, that, it's like the famous speech by Mario Savio and the Berkeley free speech movement, where he says, there comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious that all you can do is throw your body on the gears and levers to make it stop. And that's what the Compton's Cafeteria riot was. It was trans women and gay hustlers and unhoused people and youth who had been kicked out of their families, and just the kind of down and out, and what the Chronicle, the San Francisco Chronicle called the neon sex jungle, who they're constantly getting hammered by the police, arrested, the places where they hang out are raided. I mean, it's just this constant drumbeat. And, there's always that question of like, why on this night? Why is this night different when this is a chronic problem? But for a variety of contingent reasons, one August night in 1966, the police came in to raid Compton's, and that night, the people who were there just said, hell no. They resisted arrest because they knew that they were just sort of being harassed and targeted. The police were coming in large numbers of police. It was a planned raid. It wasn't just a street fight. The cops were planning to raid Compton's that night, and the patrons of the restaurant and people who were patronizing some of the bars and other establishments in the immediate vicinity, and people who lived in those hotels, and people who just happened to be on the street that night. It's like they fought back. And it's hard to say exactly how many people were involved. I initially said, based on what a police officer who was there told me, he said, I don't know, probably 50 or 60 people. But then it's like, no, we heard that the cafeteria emptied out, and I have learned that it seated 168 people. So like I think it was more. And then I have found other eyewitnesses who were saying like, oh no, like there were people pouring out of the bars. It's like it was probably between 200 and 300 people. And so, I keep finding more and more information about it. It wasn't a riot like what happens in Detroit when they declare the Insurrection Act and send in, federal troops and the National Guard. It's not a riot like that. It's not like the Watts riot in Los Angeles. But, I call it a riot rather than like a bar fight or a street fight, because it was political, because it was intentional, because it was spontaneous. It's like what we saw happen after the murder of George Floyd. It's like there's just like a spontaneous assertion of like this cannot be. It's like we have to resist this. Just a switch gets thrown in people's minds, and that's what happened one night in the Tenderloin when the Queens fought back against the cops at Compton's.
Then what happened? How did the neighborhood change after that moment? How did the police engagement change? How did the movement of people in the neighborhood, like what did that do to the neighborhood?
It's hard to say, honestly, because it certainly seems like in the immediate aftermath of the riot, um, there was this, what I call the liberal moment. You have this one reform-oriented police officer, Elliot Blackstone, who's saying like, hey, if we just leave people alone, if they're just like living their lives, just leave them alone. It's like, they're not causing any problem. It's like we don't have to arrest them for cross-dressing, just let them be who they are. Or, people are engaged in criminal activities because they need money. It's that old song. It's like, I needed money because I had none. I fought the law and the law won. And so Elliot Blackstone was a cop who was saying like, if they had money, if they had a job, if they had social services, maybe they wouldn't be like, um, being engaged in like criminalized sexual activity, or they wouldn't have, robbed the cash register at that cafeteria or what have you. So there was a moment, I think, after the riot of the city kind of going like, oh, like, okay, like we won't do that. Like that there was like training of police officers at the police academy, or there was a trans clinic set up through the San Francisco Public Health Department. There were liaisons with the gender reassignment program at Stanford University. There were job training programs that get people off the streets and into paid employment. So you do see a lot of, I would say, expansion of possibilities in life for trans people in the immediate aftermath of the riot. How much of that is because of the riot, or how much of it is the riot is a sort of a flashpoint in history that marks when there's these broader social changes that are happening around, say, like the Johnson's war on poverty, or other kinds of social movements, feminism, gay rights, Black Power movement, American Indian movement, other kinds of racial and ethnic movements. So it's hard to say the riot had a certain effect, but I can say after the riot, there was this moment where it seemed there was more possibilities for the kinds of people who rioted in the place where the riot happened. There was something called that was set up called the Central City Anti-Poverty Target Zone, where federal, EOC, EEOC money came in for job trainings. Like there were people who had been street sex workers who can join the neighborhood youth corps or get trained to be a secretary or a beautician. There was a shift in government in a way that created new avenues for people to participate in society rather than try to figure out how to survive as an outcast with no employment prospects and very limited housing prospects.
So then for the Tenderloin neighborhood has still been where much of the activity that happens in the Tenderloin is still a lot of the vice activity still gets pushed there. There's still trans community there. So the neighborhood has changed like every neighborhood, but many things have stayed the same. I want to get to in 2017, the city legally named the transgender district. And I want to kind of get to there, but in the time between 1966 and 2017, what did change in terms of the neighborhood and the transgender experience of the neighborhood
Yeah. Well,
without flattening it? I don't want to it's complicated.
or spend the next hour droning on like a professor, right? A couple of things changed. And one of them was the way police power operated. That it used to be in the old days, it's like each precinct kind of has its turf, and the captain is kind of almost like the boss of that turf, and the patrol officers on the streets. It's like, yeah, maybe they're running their own little protection rackets. I mean, it's not like to say that every cop was a bad cop, but that there was corruption in the practice of policing, and it was very turf based. And the district that ran the Tenderloin, there were, certainly people who supplemented their salaries, by the way they police that district. But one of the liberal reforms in the early 1960s, remember, the 60s were a decade of upheaval, particularly in San Francisco. But not just San Francisco, like most major cities, there was quote unquote urban unrest. And in cities like San Francisco, where a liberal mayor's office was elected in the early 1970s in San Francisco, that would be Alioto's mayoralty, that they changed the way policing worked, partly in response to social movement criticisms of the way that people were policed, that the way the hippies were treated, the way, the people in The Black Power and Brown Power and American Indian movements were treated, the way gay people were treated. I think of it as kind of like a liberal accommodation between radicalism and reactionary politics. They're going, no, 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 we're not Bull Connor down in the South. We're not Democratic Socialists of America. We're pragmatic liberal people, kind of like centrist people. And so there were reforms. I think of it as kind of like, well, it's a kinder, gentler police power rather than it's like an anti-police reform. But the relationship between police power and a particular territory, that's what got broken. It's like the Tenderloin is not a place now that trans people are policed into by a quasi-corrupt police power that wants to profit from their ghettoization in that space. Trans people live in that neighborhood because a lot of trans people are poor, and it's a poor neighborhood. And it's a poor neighborhood, I think, because it's what people who study urban development would call the development of underdevelopment. That there's pockets of real estate that are owned by powerful commercial real estate interests who are going like, you know what, we can buy this cheap now, and we're just going to hold on to it, and we're not going to invest in it. And when the market conditions are right, boom, we're going to flip that property and we're going to make $1 gajillion. And so the Tenderloin was one of those neighborhoods where in the 70s and into the 80s, maybe even into the 90s, it was a place that I would say was set aside for disinvestment. It's a different kind of containment zone working by different mechanisms, more economic than through raw police power, having more to do with, things like bond markets and, commercial real estate speculation than with, the stereotypical, cop on the beat twirling his, baton looking for a head to crack and a payoff or a piece of grift to get. It's like the way power operates changed. And so, like I said, there's still trans people in the Tenderloin, but they are there for different reasons.
So now we name it, though it is legally understood as the transgender district. We have an organization running the transgender district with programs for the residents and trans residents of the neighborhood. What are the meaningful ways it changes between being tolerated in a place and being able to assert claim to it?
Well, I mean, that to me is again a very complicated question that, of course, on the one hand, as a historian and as a trans person and as a trans historian who's done a lot of work on that particular neighborhood, of course, I'm thrilled to see greater recognition of the history of a community that, I'm part of in some significant way. And on the other hand, I want to think about, well, what does it actually get people to have a, pink, white, blue flag wrapped around a street post, at the corner of Turk and Taylor? And that's not in any way to disparage the good work that people do, but it's just like I can also be critical of what I would call the ethnicization of neighborhoods in San Francisco. It's kind of like, oh, the Tenderloin is now the transgender district. But, it's also a Vietnamese neighborhood, It's also a neighborhood with a, really high proportion of South Asian people. It's had a lot of Central American people. It's like, why is it just the transgender district? Or why is part of South of Market the leather district? Why is this neighborhood the Filipino district? That there's a way that I know people who are really critical of such things, they would call it like the, Disneyfication of the city. It's like, oh, now we're in Tomorrowland, and, now we're in Frontierland. And just that idea that a certain patch of turf in the city belongs to a certain community of identity. In many ways, I would say reproduces that same logic of ghettoization and segregation. If we were talking about countries, we could call it ethno-nationalism, like this is the land that the Serbs live in, or this is the land that the Croats live in. I think it can set up unnecessary tensions and frictions. And I also think, you have to look at what are the consequences of making all of these like community districts, like the Tenderloin district, they become mechanisms for the city to invest certain kinds of money, for street beautification projects or placemaking, like, putting trans pride flags up on light posts or, hanging banners. And what's the consequence of that? It's like, is it a way that raises real estate prices and drives some people out? Is it diverting money into things that are literally cosmetic without dealing with some of the underlying economic and social issues? The creation of what I would think of as quasi-ethnic neighborhoods can be a mechanism for doing kinds of urban investment and management that are not always progressive. So, I always feel I feel mixed.
And I think reasonably so. And I think one of the things I think you're pointing to is, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but there's sort of this importance of commemorating a history, but also reclaiming space. And how are you reclaiming a space that's a public shared space for who? But when you look at a space like, and I'm going to just bring it to Compton's Cafeteria, and the collective ownership of that space that is now owned by a private prison industrial mechanism, how is it important to commemorate history, but also how do you understand how that the control of space is important to that history?
Well, I mean, I'll just say, like, for example, I know not under Brianna, but under Brianna's predecessor at the trans districts, I know one of the programs that they had there was entrepreneurship incubator to like help trans people start their own businesses. And, it's like, that's a good thing. It's like, it's great to help people, I think, become economically self sustaining. But then there's also that sense of, and the best way to do that is to become a small business owner. Like, that doesn't necessarily address the underlying issues about why the Tenderloin is a poor neighborhood or why trans people have been excluded from a lot of, paid, employment. And so, I'd say, like, there have been some like really interesting half measures that have come through the trans district historically. It has come with a certain kind of ideological, political orientation. I would just say, like, it seems to be more liberal and market oriented rather than addressing, what I think of as the underlying structural problems that produce poverty in the Tenderloin. But to put that aside for a second, you ask about placemaking at the building where the Compton's Cafeteria riot took place. As you just sort of alluded to, that building, I mean, it's had a complicated history, changed hands many times after it stopped being Compton's in 1972. But by 1989, the entire building, not just the ground floor commercial space where the cafeteria was, but the residential hotel above it, what used to be called the Highland Hotel, was owned by a company called Geo Group, which is one of the world's largest private prison companies. When I was first starting to do some activism around that, the thing that we would say was, these are the people who are building the family separation camps, on the southern border. And now we can say these are one of the largest contractors with ICE. It's like they get billion-dollar contracts to build ICE detention facilities in the second Trump administration. And so the way I look at the world, these are like bad people doing bad things, to people for money. I just think um, it's an atrocity, what is being done. And so the idea that one of the largest ICE profiteers in the private for-profit prison industrial industry They run a facility in the Tenderloin, that occupies the space of this historically important act of trans resistance to policing, which I think of as it's the spear tip of the carceral complex. It's like policing is how you get people into the prison system. And so to me, there's this great irony there that this site of resistance has become a site of containment, quite literally. But it also drives home the deeper history of the Tenderloin has functioned for 150 years as a containment zone of some place. And it's like, as much as I think it's important to remember the Compton's Cafeteria riot as a moment of liberation, it's like liberation from what? It's liberation from the very things that we still see operating in that neighborhood. So I think anything having a trans district, having the Compton's Cafeteria riot play, anything that raises awareness in the present of what I find to be a really empowering, inspiring history of resistance, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that the trans district exists and that that play has been written and that the legacy of trans people in the Tenderloin is being recognized and celebrated. I think it's good, but then you have to harness it to the thing that will actually materially change the conditions of people's life. And I think resisting the carceral complex is a really great place to start. I'm totally behind this community-based effort to, as the activists who are doing all of that work say, liberate the building for sort of community serving uses rather than profiting from our criminalization.
I want to ask you, and maybe this is me pushing back a little, or maybe just kind of questioning your when you talked about the incubator program and how it's not addressing some of the systemic challenges of the poverty in the neighborhood. Is it not? Is it? I mean, I think there's
Well, sure, it
investment.
does, for some people, but, I'm just saying, and this is me, like, wearing my politics on my sleeve, which is that, I don't think market-based solutions are ultimately gonna serve justice, and so, like, right, some people are gonna be able to, like, become, business owners and pay their property taxes and, hire 5 people to work in their shop, right? And does it change the conditions in the Tenderloin that have produced the poverty in that neighborhood? That's me saying, you know, I hope everybody, like, finds a way to, like, live the life that they wanna live and feel secure in their housing and their food and, not be subjected to, extrajudicial violence and social stigma, right? Just like, I just don't think that capitalism ultimately gives that to it's not the greatest good for the greatest number. You can make it work for you, like, more power to you, you know?
I mean, somebody's gonna invest in the Tenderloin. I'd rather it be a trans woman coming out of an SRO than Twitter, right, at the
But,
end of the day.
but I mean, I'm just gonna say, what if that woman is Caitlyn Jenner? It's just like, it's like you can't link an identity to a politics. It's like, any conservative black people?
Well, sure.
Yeah, alright. Well, and so wait, you mean it's like black people are not a minority that are, like, fighting for their liberation in the afterlives of slavery? It's like, you can't just say, because a person belongs to a certain identity community, therefore, they have a certain politics. You just
No,
can't.
and but isn't it more about, like, there have been an unweighted lack of opportunity for people in the trans
I
community.
I believe in affirmative action, man. I believe in DEI. I believe that we should take down structural barriers to s equal access to opportunity. That's a very liberal way of saying that. But I don't think that just because a person is a certain kind of person that you can say what their politics are gonna be. It's like, "Hello, Margaret Thatcher. Hello." Like, it's like, what? You mean they're anti-abortion and they wanna, like, break unions? Ideally, I'd love to see a trans woman of color get her feet under her if she hadn't had that opportunity before, but does that mean that I think that we're gonna agree politically about something?
Right, but I guess like, where you lose me on this, and I love, like, trying to understand this. Why is the politics important to this conversation? Because 'Cause isn't it more about investing an opportunity for people who haven't had equal access to opportunity?
It's just me being cynical. It's just like,
That's
where's
fair.
the money coming from? Who's investing? What does it serve? I will just say it's like, I do not believe that at the end of the day, the market is going to equally distribute resources to all.
Of
I
course it's
don't.
not.
Right. And so, if the problem of the Tenderloin right now is what I would call, like, like the deliberate production of underinvestment, the development of underdevelopment, so that it's like you've got very powerful, rich entities that are basically holding property there, not investing in it, letting it like turn to crap, being slumlords, so to speak, because what they are doing is like they have the capacity to wait for some future moment when they can make big, huge profits. I mean, let's look at what happened to the corner of Turk and Market, like where the Seraph Hotel is now. Was that a good thing that that happened? So, like, we want to talk about the history of the neighborhood. So, some of the oldest gay bars in the city were on that block. It was the historic, cruising zone for gay men. It's if you want to talk about this history that we're celebrating with the transgender district, that little slice was carved out of it. And these historically significant properties were just destroyed. The destruction of those buildings is what actually funded the transgender district. It was the developers of the Seraph Hotel who give, I forget how much money it was. I think a few $100,000 that set up the trans district. They build luxury apartments and hotels that proved not to be profitable because they were a little ahead of market. But they have ground floor space where the mayor's office of economic development is like, oh, we're going to subsidize trans and people of color owned businesses here. And so there is a way that you could talk about the transfer of this block of the Tenderloin right on Market Street into private hands to get a little kickback to do something that doesn't change the condition of trans people in the Tenderloin
It's cosmetic.
much at all. It's very cosmetic. There's some window dressing. So yeah, there's a few people who have connections to City Hall or to the district who do, it's like, and I don't, criticize people for like wanting to like have a business and do well and that, maybe their businesses, serve the community or whatever. But it's like there's a few people who benefit, but it doesn't actually change the dynamics of the transfer of city real estate into the hands of international developers that give a pittance back to the community that they are taking up space in. And so like I just don't see that whole mechanism as something that ultimately like results in the just distribution of wealth, access or benefit to the affected communities. There can be good pieces that come out of it, but ultimately it's not a practice that I think results in justice for all.
That's fair. But you do see some value in it. It's just not systemical.
I mean, it's kind of like saying, you know, just, does Bill Gates do good things with his billions of dollars? It's like, yeah, like fight malaria or, whatever. But do I think an economic system that results in, like the 200 wealthiest people in the world having as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. No, I don't think that's a good system at all. And so if there's a little noblesse oblige that happens, among the Gilded Age plutocrats, it's like, money's money. It's like you take it, you get something that you need. It's like it serves a good need, fine. But is it a good system? No.
So rather than establishing the transgender district, we should just overturn capitalism.
Well, I could say we could reformulate that. It's like, how could the establishment of a transgender district be part of overturning capitalism rather than reinforcing capitalism? Because, like I said, I think it's good. It's like, I think honoring the history is good. There's probably going to be people I know who work there who are going to listen to this podcast, and I am not saying anything negative about the people who are doing the work. Or it's like even talking about the police department. My next door neighbor's a cop. He's a really nice guy. We get along just fine. It's like, but I have criticisms of the way policing works. None of us who are alive made the world that we were born into. Like there were inequalities that existed, there's injustice that existed before we came into it. And, you can envision a different world, but you can't necessarily change everything overnight. You have to work with where you are. And so, if you can do some good for some people, given how the city finances, work with creation of these, community investment, community business district things, it's like, okay. Ultimately, I don't think that's the way to go. I only think it gets you so far. It would be the question of what do you do with the public memory of a trans riot against the police? It's like, do you put pink, white, and blue stripes on flagpoles? It's like that, that's my question. Or do you use it to do something else? Identity and recognition is not enough.
Right, but isn't identity and recognition vitally important in it? Like more people understand the history of the trans community in San Francisco because of your film.
Yeah.
Did your film change the structural inequities in the district? It led to conversations, but not as a film.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I would say that's a fair thing. But I guess my other question is what's the story that's being told? It's like I've never said that the film is enough, right? But it's but telling the story about the riot, I think, is a good thing to do. And the Tenderloin district, why do we keep saying that? The trans district and the Tenderloin, they've had the riot party. They do a lot of, public memory work around the riot. But, here, I'll just tell you another story that I think, for me, captures the ambivalence about this. That that film came out in 2005, and that there were some trans people who were involved in city government, on different boards and commissions, who were it's like, oh wait, next year is the 40th, anniversary. We need to have some kind of commemoration, of the riot. And they did a lot of work to bring out the entire command structure of the police department, and to create an award for Elliot Blackstone, and to put a plaque in the sidewalk, and to get, statements from the governor's office or the state assembly. I mean, Kamala Harris was there when she was state attorney general. And so I remember being at that event, and I thought, well, this is really cool at one level, that it's the entire command structure from the chief of police on down in the police department is showing up to commemorate a riot where the Queens kicked the cops' asses that night. That says something about the shifting role of trans people as a constituency in this city. I think at another level, that same commemoration, was basically a public way of saying oh, the police department's really different now, and the city is different, and you don't have those same problems, and haven't we really advanced? And, it didn't do anything to actually change the conditions on the ground. Now, does it become an instance for doing the work of creating public memory in a way that serves a more liberatory goal? Or is it a way of kind of having a capture of the radical potential of the riot to say the liberal capitalist power structure that exists acknowledges that this thing happens and we've just absorbed it. It's like it's not an either or, it's a both and it's the work that we do, as living people in the present agitating and advocating for the world that we want to see. It's the uses we make of those stories that ultimately determines their significance and influence.
Yeah, so you have a big presentation and a big acknowledgement, and if a homeless dude goes east of Mason, they're still going to harass him.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. This was amazing. I feel like I have more I wanted to. I think we could do 10 episodes. I'm going to have fun figuring out how to edit this and tell this story in a critical and honest way that also honors, what the district's trying to do. But I think it's important to have those conversations. That's what we're doing. So I really appreciate you bringing that perspective to it. And I think, you're right. At the end of the day, the hope is that by acknowledging the history, by putting up the pink and blue banners, it's not minimizing anything. It's acknowledging and bringing attention to. I mean, I have learned so much just in the last couple of months researching this project about Taylor and Turk.
It's a deep rabbit hole. It
It
really is.
is. It
Yeah.
is a deep rabbit hole, and it's complicated.
The thing I keep saying, maybe this is the thing for me to end on tonight. Is like if you can solve the problems of the intersections of Turk and Taylor, you can solve the problems of the world because it is all just right there. The poverty, the racism, the impact of, technology, the, commercial real estate, prison industrial complex. Just like everything is just
Addiction,
right there.
right? Corruption.
Homelessness, precarity, discrimination based on race, on citizenship, on being trans or cis. Just like it's just all right there.
Yeah, it's quite a crossroads, isn't it?
It is quite a crossroads, and so you find the joy in the struggle.
Yeah. Susan, I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you for doing this work and telling this story. The Tenderloin is the hardest neighborhood in San Francisco, but it is my favorite neighborhood in San Francisco.
And it's mine.